welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, man.
So for the uninitiated, and I would include myself in this, tell us what game theory is.
Well, very simply, game theory is kind of the mathematical study of conflict or cooperation between any kind of intelligent, rational decision maker. So it's really using some detailed analysis, mathematics, things like that to help kind of predict behavior. But it can be used in a lot of different ways. I think, really simply just navigating your way through an interpersonal kind of situation. Really complex versions of it involve, lots of different stakeholders or, players, if you will, is the term we use in game theory. But how do they, ultimately achieve what's important to them without necessarily kind of burning bridges? There's always, an outcome in every interaction that we have. So just using some analytics to understand, what our best pathway forward maybe is a really good kind of basic way to put it.
So is it like a statistical study of the probabilities of how outcomes are going to be based on people and how they work together?
Yeah, great question. It's a little bit less probabilistic and more kind of behavior driven. So the kind of classic prisoner's dilemma is something that a lot of people are familiar with. You have two prisoners, right? If one sort of rats on the other, they can get their sentence diminished. Whereas if they both kind of rat on one another, they both go away for 10 years. If one chooses to remain silent and the other doesn't, they get off scot-free. This is sort of 2x2 game theory, but it's a little bit more behavioral focus, I think, is the easiest answer there.
First of all, this is wild. And I mean, as a therapist, I'm super...
The coolest.
Well, I can tell. I mean, right off the top, I'm like, God, where was game theory when Harley was ratting on JJ to get him thrown in the prison? What was going on? Who are the game theorists there to help out the Cro-Mags? Okay.
That's a deep cut. That's a good reference.
Thank you. I pride myself from using my inane knowledge of hardcore to make examples in the business world. Now, what's the point of this, man? What's the use of this thing? Because I'm going to tell you, I'm super interested in this idea, again, especially coming from like a therapeutic background. But you always hear people talk about it in podcasts, and they speak about it like with this great level of knowledge, but it always sounds like maybe like a stupid person who's latched onto like a cool sounding thing. And they're like, oh yeah, it's just like classic game theory. It's like, do you really know what you're talking about? So like, what are we actually talking about? What's the practical application of this stuff?
For sure. I think honestly, conflict resolution is going to be a big one. If you have any type of leadership role, conflict is something you're going to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Conflict resolution comes in many formats, certainly, whether it's, a situation you're trying to navigate your way out of, whether it's a labor dispute or something that's a really large scale, or something as simple as, you work in what's a good example? Let's say you work in a sales environment, right? You have a top sales guy and he decides he's going to leave the organization. As a leader, that's a big hiccup. You're losing a key talent, but you maybe have other individuals that you think may be able to manage the clients of this individual, whatever that looks like. Very simply, let's say you have two people that want that book of business. Well, ultimately you have to make a decision. You have to say, somebody has to get this book of business. Game theory really just allows us to understand that each of these entities, yourself included, are going to have something that's going to be important to you in the situation. So me as a leader, I really want this book of business to be serviced properly. The two salespeople competing for it, naturally they want that book of business. The very, very simple, classic kind of game theory here would be the equivalent of, I don't know if you have kids, but there's this old thing, you cut, you choose. You have one kid who's going to split the piece of cake. Well, the one is going to, split the cake and the other gets to choose. That's game theory at its most basic format. Well, if you say to these two salespeople, all right, you divide up the book of business, person A, you get to divide up this book of business. Person B gets to pick which portion of the book of business that they want. All of a sudden, you have a kind of meaningful conflict resolution. I no longer have to make a decision that's going to appear like I've favored one entity over another. I have these two kind of individual entities that were a bit combative, but now they both have a resolution that they determine is fair. So that's a really simple way of sort of saying, how does understanding conflict and perhaps removing the onus of one person to just make a decision using a little bit of basic game theory to get to, a proper resolution.
Okay. So what does the day-to-day of a game theorist look like? And I know everyone's different companies, different disciplines, but what does like the role of a game theorist look like day to day?
I think the biggest thing is understanding whether a problem is going to be multi-stakeholder in nature. If you came to me and said, if you're a large corporation, you came to us and said, hey, we need to overhaul our IT department. Well, it's not really something we're going to be able to work on. Is there conflict? Is there uncertainty? Is there different stakeholders that are vying for positioning here? No, you just need a better IT, solution. The day-to-day is really determining whether, I think ultimately the tools of game theory are going to be helpful, because you totally killed it earlier. It's become this kind of industry buzzword, especially as it's, gained popularity. It's like, well, game theorists say this, and people are saying, you can use game theory to win your March Madness bracket or whatever. Ultimately, that's, it's not really a tool that's going to help you. It's just become this kind of flashy buzzword. So really the day-to-day is determining whether there are problems, first and foremost, that game theory can actually help with, and then helping logically kind of work through the basics of them. So for every problem, there's always going to be, we call them players. That's the game theory term. Who are the players? Who are the stakeholders? Who does this really matter to? The second piece there is, what are their options? What can they do? Rather than getting too wrapped up in the, what they want to do or what they should do, really just focus on what could occur or what they could do. And then the last piece is, what are their preferences? What is important to them ultimately? Because if you have something that's really, really highly valued by one party, one person, one entity, versus something that's, less so, perhaps there's a trade-off there. Perhaps I can give up something that doesn't really matter all that much to me, to somebody that it's going to be, really influential or effectual in terms of changing their perspective on something. So I think that's a long-winded way of not really answering your question. It's sort of, I think the day-to-day is, do we determine whether we have a really good problem, and then kind of breaking down into the problem into those key components to see if it's then worth analyzing.
Okay.
Analysis itself, it kind of works like, works like a chess match that you're going to run a couple of billion times. But at its core, the concepts are really applicable to so many different situations.
All right. So is this like when we're talking about like the analysis of stuff, is this like gut feeling, like reading people, reading situations, or is there actually some kind of technique involved, or is there some kind of software involved? Like, what is the way that things are analyzed?
So for us, there is a software component to it. It's almost like, chess playing software on steroids, if you will. You're sort of, what I do as the entity that's kind of navigating those relationships is I really try and take a team of people that are entrenched on a problem and help them kind of understand and organize their best knowledge. So again, going back to those three key principles, who's involved? What could they do? What do they want? And then the software itself, we kind of use as an assist, because every time you're adding an action to any type of model, it doubles in size, right? That gives you an exponential growth. It's another decision that can be taken or maybe not taken. So even in a small model, let's say you have 30 different options, that's going to give you a billion different ways that the situation can play out, right? You have 2 to the power of 30. So a decision can be made or not made times 30, right? And that's going to give you a billion ways. So it just becomes unmanageable for people to work through. But what's interesting, and I think prior to maybe me joining this organization, me being so entrenched in these game theory ideas, was that, there's a huge human element to it as well. Like you can have an academic output that says, hey, this is something that's probably going to occur. You have to look at it and say, is that actually logical? Does that actually make sense in the real world? Or is this something that just only makes sense in kind of that software driven or academic kind of space?
Yeah. So like the way I look at things when I'm working with clients and, kind of like doing team assessments or an organizational assessment or even an individual assessment is always use a concept that I call hard data and soft data. Hard data being like things that you can actually factually know based on our general understanding of what can and can't be a fact, right? Like, what is this person's job? How many reports do they have? Like, how many peers do they have? So like hard data. Soft data would be like, how do people feel about things? What do they want? What are their goals? And soft data and the reason I call it soft data is that someone could say something to you, but it doesn't actually mean, and they might even think it's the truth, but it actually might not be the truth, because from a psychological perspective, their actions are different than a person who's actually pursuing that goal. Using that framework of like hard data, things you can factually say like, yeah, like here's a nail. I know that this is a nail, versus soft data, which would be things just based on people's wants, desires, what they think they know about themselves, what they think they know about other people. How does game theory play with those two things? And I know I'm injecting my framework into game theory, but from a basic idea of like hard data versus soft data, how does that play?
Yeah, that's actually a really cool question because I think it can be both depending on how you want to structure what your ultimate goal is. Like if let's say you have a labor dispute, right? Let's say you have an organization and they have, we worked on a really, really cool case sort of in Southeast Asia around a labor dispute. There's a mining company, extraction company, and you have all of these employees, right? And they've walked out of the job and they're saying, hey, we don't want to do this anymore. Well, we get brought in to say, is there a way that we can kind of navigate through this situation? We're really in the trenches here. We obviously know that these people aren't happy. That's something that's going to be soft. But there's going to be a number of hard factors that may influence how they respond to this situation. Perhaps it's giving them benefits. Well, that's tangible. You can put a dollar value on what providing somebody with benefits may be. That's an option, though. We could do that. We could also just increase our investment in employee support programs. Well, that's a little bit less tangible. What does an employee support program actually look like? So I think dialing in what the goal is really the key, because you can really use it in both. If you wanted to build a model that was all just behavioral pieces, and I like the language that you use there, from you have this therapy lens, sometimes things aren't always so cut and dry. It's not like I'm going to give you $5. It's I'm going to give you my time and attention, but I want to know that that's valued. Well, those are kind of very different constructs. One's really, really concrete and the other's, sort of intangible. But ultimately, it's still an action. If it's still an action that you can take, and it's still something that somebody is going to feel a particular way about it, you can kind of navigate your way through it. So I think we've worked on, I personally got to work on some really, really cool high-level stuff. And the high-level stuff tends to be more of that kind of softer stuff. And then we've worked on really, really specific granular, like, how do we win a tender in Sweden? Well, the options might be offer a 2% discount, a 5% discount, and a 7% discount on our product. That becomes, I probably shouldn't say this, a little bit less interesting, certainly, but the value of the exercise still remains the same, right? You're going to get insights on what your best option is to take.
Yeah, let's play with that soft data side of it a little bit more. So can I give you an example of where I think of like hard versus soft data?
Please, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about like there's a mountain that someone wants to climb, and there's an established route up the mountain, and it's an advanced trail. So hard data would be like, we know where the mountain is. We know there's a mountain. We know there's a trail. We know that based on how trail difficulty is assessed, you need to have a certain amount of skill, ability, experience, all of that certain kind of gear. So then we could look at the person. We say, okay, well, do you have the gear to be able to do this? Do you have the experience to be able to do this? Do you have would be kind of generally assessed the amount of experience and physical fitness to be able to do this? So that for me would be all hard data. And then hard data would also be like, weather, like all of those kinds of things, time. Soft data would be someone's observation of themselves and someone's like way that they look at themselves, and even someone looking at a challenge and being like, oh, I could do that, when in reality they actually, based on the hard data, actually couldn't do it based simply on the hard data. But someone's assessment of themselves can trick them into thinking they can do something that they actually can't do, and they'd go and do it and fail miserably. Or soft data and someone's belief in themselves and understanding of certain kinds of situations can cause them to not do something that they totally could do 100%. But where I think it gets really compelling to me is that someone's resilience, and how do you measure someone's resilience? Someone's belief in themselves, someone's willingness to take risk could get them to do something that they do not have the physical fitness, experience, maybe even gear to do. But somehow they still do that thing. And we see this all the time. We just see people just bust out, run a marathon. People do these totally wild things just because the way they think about themselves and the opportunity, but also their resilience and ability to adapt and maintain is much stronger. So for me, that's soft data, because you can't tell whether or not someone can do that or a group of people could do that. So how does that play into game theory?
I think kind of neutralizing the way that we look at what an actual option is really what helps us kind of capture those ideas. Because you're right, can you execute on something? Well, there's a number of, tangible factors that are going to go into that. The intangible piece really comes from understanding what we want and how that can kind of influence us. So I think, as a construct, this is sort of a good example, because how do you tangibly say, do I have resilience? Well, there's a number of components that are going to contribute to whether you do or not. sometimes just kind of neutralizing the way we talk about things is really what's going to help us kind of draw at that idea of whether we will be able to do something or whether we won't. So for example, if you were going to, let's say we're going to build a mini model kind of on the fly of this example that you have, do we have the gear or purchase the gear? That could be your option, right? I could purchase the right equipment. I mean, it's very tangible. I could purchase the right equipment to do this. But, do I have the resilience? That's much tougher of an ask, much tougher to build out an option. So maybe the option in isolation is to execute on a plan. Well, the plan itself, now all of a sudden, now we have, we're planning for the logical, we're planning for weather, we're planning for, the gear again, to use that example. What we can't plan for, what we can't incorporate into the plan is this idea that we maybe, have the wherewithal to do something. Where that piece comes into this is in the preferences, right? So when we start talking about what's important, that's where we can kind of draw out some of those, softer examples. So maybe what we're looking at is climb the mountain. That's an option. I can either do that or I can not do that. Ultimately, if we simplify our thinking, in isolation, that is your option. What's going to go into making sure you climb the mountain is really going to be where it's going to become a lot more nuanced. My other options are, buy my gear, train for a year prior to doing this. These are all decision points that I could take or could not take. When we get into the idea of preferences, we start talking about the impact of taking these options. Well, maybe it's really important for me to get the gear, right? That's going to be high up on my idea of preferences. Maybe what's most important to me is actually climbing that mountain, though. This decision point where it's like, I'm going to do this thing. If that tends to be the highest preference you have or the most impactful option that you have in front of you, all of a sudden we can kind of release our own blinders and we can say, well, if this is more important to me than anything else here, if this is more important than the gear, this is more important to my fitness, then we can start breaking down the intangibles that are going to go into, ultimately executing on what's most valuable to us. So I think very simply, when it comes down to those three, I'll call them inputs. Who's important in this? We know who that is. I'm important. I'm trying to do this thing. What can I do? Well, I can put my finger on that. What do I want, or what are my preferences? What's most impactful to me? That's kind of where we can really get at this idea of those intangibles of, what's it going to take for me to actually get to this that is outside of the scope of just spending money on gear or training for a year. So if what's paramount to me is climbing that mountain, what am I going to need that's not represented in a tangible option to help me get there?
Yeah. I like that. Everything that I do, both, in my business and then musically and just basically in my life, is always about like pushing myself, taking that next leap. I'm relatively fearless when it comes to stuff like that. And actually, let me say this. I will always take the leap, but it doesn't mean I'm not afraid. I'm definitely afraid. And I shouldn't say I'm fearless. I'm actually totally afraid of when I do things, but I don't let that fear stop me. And I don't let that fear stop me because I'm like, really have a good sense of, I got a strong track record of being able to pull stuff off. I can adapt when there's, chaos and tragedy and horrible stuff, but more so my sense of self of being able to like really make things happen is established on a long history of doing it and just like a deep belief in myself. But it doesn't mean I don't wake up at like 3 a.m. and, I'm like totally terrified and have anxiety and all of those things. And the reason I bring that in is what I find quite hazardous around these kind of like what I call marquee terms or marquee words. So for example, people talking about game theory, but really not knowing what game theory is, or resilience. And I find it really dangerous in leadership where people get these words or phrases that sound right. Like, oh yeah, we're going to build up the resilience of our team. It's like, man, I mean, how? Like, what are you talking about? Or like, oh, from a game theory perspective, well, what are you actually talking about? And I'd boil it down to I think the word that really gets the most punishment on this is strategy. It's like, oh, we just got to be more strategic, or that leader needs to be more strategic. And I always just kind of roll my eyes when I hear that. It's like, if I ask you 2 questions, you are going to be on your heels. You're going to have no idea what you're talking about because you're using a word that feels good, but it actually doesn't have any true value in the discussion. So when you unpack game theory in that way, for me, it's like that makes sense. Is there anything you want to say on what I just said there?
Yeah, I think you're so bang on, right? We have these things that kind of enter into our zeitgeist, these terms that come about, and you have a basic level of understanding. Like, I think you can read a piece of paper on the prisoner's dilemma and sort of understand it at its core. What really is important is understanding what is valuable to these actors. You know, if you're in a leadership position, or let's say you're the executive at a company and you have goals that you've laid out and they're just growth goals. You can say, well, these are all these things we can do to drive growth. And if it's not working, we need a better strategy to do so. Ultimately, the people that are in the trenches, the people that you're responsible for leading, it's really important to understand what is valuable to them. Again, I keep using this term preferences. It's just a game theory term, but it's really value. That's really what we're talking about. And, you know, in a prior organization, I was in a leadership role, and I think I've learned a lot. I've sort of round the edges on my own ego over the years. And I think that's something we all struggle with. But, it was such a masterclass in understanding that people are motivated by different things. It was a sales organization, and I'm responsible for managing a team of salespeople. Some of them are making sales left and right. Some of them aren't. And understanding that, each hurdle is different was important to me. But what I really realized when it comes to this idea, exactly what you're talking about, is when you're building the game, so to speak, you can't build it from just your own perspective. I had a salesperson I worked with, and she was so good with clients, just unbelievable. But her motivation wasn't really all that monetary. She wanted to do a good job. She wanted to, really have lasting relationships. And that was really what motivated her. She dealt with a lot of anxieties and things like that. I think we all deal with, 2021, we're more aware of what these look like. But I remember having these days where she would come into my office and she felt like she dropped the ball on something, and we would just lay on the floor in my office. I'm in a suit. I'm laying on the floor in my office with one of these salespeople that I worked with, just trying to get her to kind of calm down, get out of her own head about this misstep that she made, or it's even a perceived misstep. Perhaps it's not even a real misstep. And I had other people that I would walk into their office and I'd be like, hey, you lazy, whatever, it's time to get to work today. And those two things were so individually tailored to what those individuals want. And as leaders, what we can do is we can look at a sales force and we say, everyone here is going to be motivated by what I think they should be motivated by. Make more sales, make more money, whatever that looks like. People are motivated. People's preferences are very different. So if we can kind of better understand that idea, we can make better decisions. It's not always about saying we need a good strategy for the masses. It's about saying, what en masse can we do that's going to be valued by these people that we're trying to motivate? So I think you're really killing it. You're hitting the nail on the head there. It's so much more granular than just saying strategy this, motivation that. Those things are so, so individual. Those things are so hard to kind of tangibly, put your finger on. So I think understanding that people have different preferences, and what's at the top of priority for you might not be the same as what's at the top priority for them. So you can game everything till you're blue in the face, but if it's only your perspective, it's not really going to be a valuable game, right?
Yeah, I want to push on that in a second, but as we were talking about this, that like, oh man, these phrases and words that just like, you can hear the eyes rolling in the whatever, one-on-one meeting, you got 100 people, 1,000 people, just the eyes rolling, or those internal groans. One of the ones that just kills me is like, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I just like die inside every time I hear that. And I know leaders who have said that. Who are just great leaders, wonderful people. But it's like saying something like that, you can hear the moment where they're waiting for the applause afterwards. It's like, listen, man, that's like the most like, why don't you just hand everyone an ice cream cone in a meeting and be like, and just wait for everyone to say thank you.
I figured it out. Praise me. Yeah.
Totally. And like, I know when it's said, well, I don't know. I believe when it's said from the right place, but it's like, this is the most nonsense statement. Like, yeah, but what do you even mean by that? Like, what do you mean by culture? Culture for who? From what perspective? What are you going to do to get there? Like, what's going to happen when profits start tanking and or we have a huge spend to get the culture there and it starts really outstripping what you want to do financially and make that investment. It's such a complex thing. And one of the things, and I believe we're on the same page with this, one of the things that I just encourage leaders to do is really think about what you're saying to people. And I have a very simple way that I look at it. Every single time you're communicating with anybody, And this is just in general in the world, but I'd say from a leadership perspective, you got to be thinking, if you're writing an email, you're sending a text, you're having a conversation, you're doing one of three things at any given time. You're building relationships, maintaining relationships, or you're breaking relationships down. Like, I believe in our day-to-day, we're essentially spend most of our time maintaining relationships, but you can maintain a great relationship, you can maintain a neutral relationship, or you can maintain a terrible relationship because you're stuck in a cycle with people. And a lot of that has to do with like the things that we get stuck in saying and the ways that we talk about things. And I encourage people, it's like in your day-to-day as leaders, it's like say less, speak with caution, be thoughtful, and not like awful caution, but just thoughtfulness. You want to be trying every day to be like building relationships or maintaining good ones. And if you can, building from neutral relationships or even damaging or poor relationships. That should really be the goal of a leader. Is you should always be thinking in your communication, you're maintaining your strong relationships and you're elevating your neutral relationships or repairing your poor relationships if you can, at the very least, not doing any more damage to them. And always thinking about how do you like build and maintain that stuff. Things like, culture eats strategy for lunch. For me, that's just like a damaging statement because everyone, like, there's going to be people who are like, oh yes, oh my God, the great. I'm using my aristocratic tone there when I take on that accent, but that idea, like, oh yeah, that's the greatest thing. But like, there's so many people in the room that are like, I hate my job. I wish you would shut up. Like, it's really important. Yeah, it's really important. So. But there is a way that I think that we could hit on there that I want to talk about. But anything you want to say about what I just mentioned?
Yeah, I think just, working with the type of people that I do, like, we tend to spend a lot of our time working on really like large, complex problems, with senior leadership teams at, Fortune 100 companies more often than not. And as somebody who's, been in leadership roles throughout my, professional career, what I've realized is a lot of that, sort of buzzword speak and all the eye rolling and all of that, it tends to be sort of with the middle of the pack, if you will, like people that are sort of on their way up, because the best leaders, what they're communicating is that they trust the people that they're working with. They're not up there just saying blanket things in hopes that everybody receives them properly. You sort of shed this ego and you say, well, I'm in this leadership position. I've surrounded myself with, good quality people that know perhaps more about what we're trying to do here than I do. And I think, communicating appropriately what your goal is, you will be far more respected by shedding all that BS, just saying like, this is the goal. We're going to rely on, you guys and the ethos that we're trying to build here to get there is far more impactful. Just saying, I trust you. I trust, the leadership people that are reporting into me. And there's this sort of idea that became really clear the more senior the folks I worked with. They just don't go down that road. So what is it, sort of interestingly about kind of middle management, if you will, or people that are on sort of an upward trajectory, if you want to talk about the corporate world, what is it that makes them think that ultimately, these things are what's going to motivate people? And I think more often than not, there's just no emphasis put on capturing the perspectives of the people that are rolling their eyes. They're saying, I'm your leader. You need to kind of listen to this thing that I'm implementing. But those people's leaders don't think like that. So why do they? So I think, just sort of an observation about working with just different levels of structure. The best leaders don't do that stuff. But the majority of the kind of middle management type people, tend to. And it's really an interesting kind of study about just, how as we progress as leaders in general, we can be more effective by kind of shedding the things that we think are effective. Am I making sense there?
It makes perfect sense. And let me just add to that, because like I think that people who say stuff like that, I don't think there's any like villains like twisting their mustaches like, man, I'm going to say this thing now. I think it's just I think it's people just doing their best. But like when it comes to leaders saying stuff like that, I think that people's time is like pressured, like I just know tons of leaders who are like, crap, I've got this important thing I need to talk about. And in the mountaintop moments where people can prepare and they've got time, and even then they're time pressured. So there's usually not enough time that goes into what they're going to prepare. So, but in mountaintop moments, I find less of that stuff. Or if it's said, it's like, ooh, it's cringy and people learn from it. And sometimes I'll talk to someone like me about it. It's less about those mountaintop moments. It's more like when you're in the valley, like your day to day. It's like just the intention of speaking. People don't have time to prepare and to really be in the moment. And where I go with that is that people are mixing up the function of their job with the mission of their job. So like the function of your job is like the things that you're supposed to do. Like I got to have this conversation, I got to drive execution. But if the function of your job dominates your time, then you don't have anything time to do the mission of your job. And the mission of your job is, why does your job exist? Well, your job exists, if you're a leader, to lead people. And leading people is like a really wonderful, complex, nuanced thing that requires a ton of time to really think about it. And I find that people spend way too much time on the function of their job, like kind of like checking all the boxes, and less time on the mission. Like, what's the purpose of your job and how do you accomplish that? And a huge amount of how you accomplish that is how you speak with people and what you say and taking that time. And very often my work with leaders is about like just changing up their time allocation, about like really understanding like, hey, when you're in the valley, it's one thing to do well when you're on the mountaintop and you speak to a bunch of people and you say those things. Maybe you use a bit of those like whatever ridiculous phrases, but you can typically recover from that. It's in the day to day when you're like, oh, well, coming from a classic game theory space, it's like, nah, no, don't say that. Like, take a step back, think about what you're saying. Do you really know what you're talking about? I spend a lot of time with people that are kind of reformatting, like, hey, focus more on the purpose. Like, what is your mission as a leader? How do you execute on that? And less on the function, because anyone can do the function. Very few people can do like the mission. Like, what's your purpose as a leader?
Oh, I think that's so key. And hitting on purpose, if you can get the people that you're leading to kind of buy into that idea, what you say just holds so much more value. And I think you lose the purpose when you get into all of that, sort of industry buzz terminology that you think is going to land. And, years ago, like I've worked with sensational leaders, and I've worked with people that are, put on a masterclass in how not to lead. And I think I always kind of think about it like this. A good leader, let's say you're sitting on the beach with 10 people, somebody gets up and they're going to go for a walk down the beach, right? A good leader is somebody that you just kind of inherently want to follow. Somebody that you just feel like they must have a purpose for going where they're going. And I'm willing to attach my cart, to that horse because I believe enough in this person's purpose that I'm interested in taking that journey with them or exploring it with them. The bad leader is the guy that's like, you guys have to all get up and follow me down this beach because what's down there, you're going to love it. You know what I mean? And I think there's, like I said, pretty basic analogy, but there are going to be people in this life that you're going to want to follow. And the purpose-driven people, 99 times out of 100 tend to be those people because you're muddying what your purpose actually is by just giving people that sort of lip service and all of that, all of that stuff. It's like every email we're going to loop back around to something. What are we looping back to? Like, just give me and there's a whole list I'm sure that we could go through and we can wax on about these things that people say that just instantly, lose you. But what you're losing, at its core is the belief in that person's sort of purpose. When you say those things, you sort of lose your faith in what the broader goal is because it feels to you and, and maybe, the way we feel about things should be, considered more carefully when we have professional interactions. But it feels to you like this person doesn't have as much of a purpose because they're filling you with noise, fluff, things that, are unimpactful to you.
So when should someone, an individual leader or a team or an organization, when should they start thinking about working with a game theorist? Like, what's the kind of situations that people would be considering working with someone like that?
I think anytime that there's conflict or cooperation that's necessary between a number of different kind of parties. So really, for us, we've worked on really, really broad strokes, strategic issues, big organizations. How do we invest our $1 billion R&D budget over the next 5 years? Well, competitors are going to respond. That's a source of conflict. So, perhaps we're the disruptor. Perhaps we're a status quo strategy that we're exploring. But, there's a clear-cut idea of conflict and cooperation. We've worked on the really, really granular, type project as well. It's, we have a product that we're launching in a region that we're unfamiliar with. How is the buyers or however you want to frame it, how are the people that are going to be receiving this product going to actually view it? Is it going to be favorable? Do they have something that they already, like? And those types of projects tend to be a lot more granular. But I think the easy answer to the question is anytime that there's conflict or cooperation necessary in a group of different stakeholders, that's where game theory really kind of comes into the fray.
Okay, cool. What does someone's background need to be? So like, for example, can like any Yahoo hop into a role like this, or do you have to have some like really serious like training and background?
So full disclosure, like I work with a team of really, really insanely smart analysts. Those are the people that kind of run the softwareized versions of it. For me, a lot of my training, if you will, like I have an economics background. I work in finance before I worked here. But I think going back to my punk rock kind of days, being a young guy, like my motivation throughout my professional career was always to have an impact. So when I kind of came across this organization, I got put in touch with our president here, our now president, and we just had a really good informal chat about how, if we better understood one another, if we better understood how people interact, how organizations interact, we could all make better decisions. And he kind of took me through the Coles Notes version of some things that have really had like a global impact that this organization has worked on. And I said, I gotta be a part of it. I got to be a part of this. Like, going back to what you said, I'm ready to dive into the deep end. Like, I'm not as academic nearly as almost everybody else that kind of worked as part of our organization. These are guys with mathematics and engineering backgrounds, really specific, field specific, academic histories. And for me, I was kind of fast and loose. I was like a band guy. I went to business school for a little bit, found my way in the finance world. Making an impact was kind of my key motivator. So I wasn't going to let it rest until I kind of got to join this organization. So I, put together a lot of, we'll call them case studies. I did a presentation to the organization about, this idea of desirable difficulty and how my particular path, led me to be equipped to kind of work in this field. There's a lot that went into it. I won't bore you to death with all the details, but I think ultimately, the field itself, if you have a passion for understanding people, I think if I could go back and do it all again, I would have done some kind of social sciences. Like I read a lot of Gladwellian type authors who kind of talk about, how interactions maybe don't always go the way that we think they do. And I think you just got to really love the way that interaction occurs and also take an interest in why sometimes it's really good and sometimes it's really not. That's a kind of a very simple way of looking at the world. But if that hits your kind of passion buttons, which it did for mine, how do I make a global impact and how do I navigate personalities and egos and desires and all of these things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis as leaders? I really sunk my teeth into the whole concept. So it took about a year for me to join these walls and, lots of back and forth sort of saying like, I'm the right guy. And they're saying, well, you're not, you don't have a math PhD. I'm like, full disclosure, I do not, but I do have a lot of skills that I've picked up over the years that I think could be a real asset here. So I think you just got to love people and interaction, whether it's a small scale, big scale. And, I think, to your background, I think any type of therapy, addiction counseling, all of these things are just kind of, they're sort of the 2x2 version of the same concept. It's me helping you through a situation. It's kind of just the more sort of robust version of that. It's me helping you potentially helping somebody else potentially helping another stakeholder. But at the same, sort of basic level, it's about what do people want? What's going to motivate them? How do we get you out of a rut, whether it's personally or professionally? How do we navigate through a situation that's, maybe too complex or that we're missing the forest for the trees on, sort of at a really conceptual level.
Yeah. And I love that story, man. And, to be really clear. So when I first became a therapist, first an addiction counselor, it was a long time ago, and about 20 years ago. And, it was the Wild West, man. Like anybody could be like an addictions counselor, like literally anybody. And I remember thinking, like looking to my left and my right in these classes I was in, I was like, oh, this is not good. Like they got to have some kind of standard here. And then, and then it overcompensated, and it went from basically like anyone could be an addiction counselor to, you know, have to have a master's degree. And that's cool. Like I'm fine with that as well. But then it became this like hard block where it's like, you have to have a master's degree, because that's where it's like, you know, now we want people who have more like a therapeutic background training. It's like, well, you know what? A lot of people I know with master's degrees are also like not very, like, again, I could look left and right when I was doing my master's and being like, I don't know about this. Like, to me, it's not all about the background. It's not all about the education. It has a lot of nuances, you know, like maybe from classic game theory perspective, like there's a lot of like hard data and soft data that's at play of whether or not someone could be of value as a coach or as a therapist. And I think the way that we evaluate people simply based on like their resume and like what are the experience points and what are the education points, that's only just a small part of the picture. And when we get into jobs that are like, well, you have to minimum have this to be able to apply, it's like, I think that's weird. And I'll just say, as like a coach, I remember the first coaching company I joined, the boss was just like an embarrassing clown, like just what an embarrassing leader. And I'm very comfortable to say that because I just think he's just the worst. But I remember this guy, like he was looking at my education and my experience, and he was kind of like into that. But what he hated was the tattoos and that I came from a punk band and all of this. And he was speaking about it as if I'd done like, you know, some terrible crime. He was like, well, you know, this punk, blah, blah. And I just thought like, dude, this is going to be the most useful thing here. And it ended up being, and that's how I started Cadence, was like, basically I'm the guy that's like covered in tattoos, played in punk bands, got quite a bit of experience working as a therapist on like a street level. Like I just get people because I've been in a tour, equally because I've been a therapist, and equally because I've been in a tour van. And I am a firm believer that like people could be in super crazy, like really intense roles and not necessarily have like the educational background, but they just kind of get people.
Oh, I think that's just so important to understanding, you know, there's a skill set around being able to navigate your way through interpersonal relationships that no book is ever going to teach you. And, you know, going back to that kind of hard line, like you need a master's to be an addiction counselor, I think you need empathy. You know, if you have a master's and you have just an utter inability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you're going to be a poor addiction counselor. You're going to be horrible at the gig. And I think, you know, so much, especially in the, you know, the corporate world and for younger people, you know, I'm mid-30s now, but for younger people that are listening, like it gets hammered into you so hard that you have to hit X amount of, you know, educational milestones before you even get a shot in the career world. Like I went to business school. I never completed that journey. Right. Like I went to business school. I felt like I was being trained to be a low level accountant at Deloitte. And I was way more entrepreneurial. I was way more invested in sort of, you know, using these kind of interpersonal skills I had to my benefit. So, you know, we had the opportunity. I played in a band called Kingdoms for a long time, and we had the opportunity to go on the road. And I was like, well, this seems like a more logical pathway for me for now, because school will certainly be here. And it's kind of punk rock to be like, I'm going to get in a van instead of going on tour. I guarantee you I learned more in that van than I would have finishing that business degree. And it's, you know, goes back to my little anecdote earlier about lying on the floor with somebody. School's not going to teach you that that's what that person needs at that moment. Those are things I learned from having a lot of different experiences with a lot of different people. You know, the punk scene, especially, you know, punk and hardcore. I can't comment too much on it now, just being like an old guy, but it used to be about camaraderie and brotherhood and finding your tribe. And these were people that, you know, had similar ethos than you, but everyone, you know, you might be at that show because your home life absolutely sucks. You might be at that show because your home life is great and you just don't get along with your parents. You know, there's everybody's kind of motivation for trying to find their tribe is different. But the interaction that these people have with one another, there's sort of this great equalizer. So if you look at it from a sort of more high level perspective, well, the great equalizer is our ability to communicate with one another. And I learned how to do that in a van. And if somebody didn't take a shot on me years ago in the finance industry of all industries, you know, I met who was a guy who was a terrific leader, going back to my beach analogy. He was that guy, but he said, I'll take a shot on you. You know, you got sleeve tattoos and I had a nose ring at the time. And I was like, you know, putting on the cheapest suit that I could afford for my interviews. And he was like, I think you have some intangible qualities here that are going to make you really good in this business. And I would take my nose ring out and go to meetings with people, and I'd put it back in at the end because I was still a punk rocker, you know. But I think I learned so much more in that van, eating ramen noodles and, you know, fighting with my bandmates, and, you know, then finishing that business degree would have ever taught me. So there's this idea about desirable difficulty, and I don't want to wax on too much here, but this idea that sometimes these types of hurdles actually build a skill set. And for me, I felt like I always kind of had this chip on my shoulder. It's like I like to think I'm a pretty smart guy, but I didn't have the traditional education, and doors were closing because of that. And it just made me work harder. It just made me be more active in my pursuits. Like, I ended up in this organization because I did a presentation to a bunch of game theorists about how I'm a good candidate because I didn't go to school. Like, that was what that presentation was about. That was kind of the tipping point. So you got to be creative, and, you know, it's sort of, you forge these tools based on, you know, having a little bit less of a traditional kind of background. So I think, yeah, so much of this life is about how we can interact with one another. And, you know, you're going to learn that somewhere along the way. Whether it's going to be in, you know, sitting and working with one-on-one with a coach. I'm like a big fan of that. You know, having somebody who objectively can kind of push back on what you think is always right, to waking up in a new city in a van, having to make friends and having to find food that you like, and, you know, having to get along with a promoter who's kind of an asshole. And, you know, you want him to, he's the only guy in that town, so you want him to like your band. You know, all of these things are just like little microcosms of success in the corporate world, success in the independent business world, the entrepreneur world. Like, you have to be able to very quickly get on the same page as somebody. And I learned to do that in the van.
Yeah, absolutely, man. 100%. I love that. It's funny when you say the cheapest suit. When I started working in the corporate world, I owned 0 suits, and I had to borrow my friend Adam Mitchell's dress pants. So Adam, shout out to you. You saved my career. And then I ended up buying 1 suit, and I was like horrified at how much it cost. And my friend Zenon helped me. So Zenon, thank you very much for that. And then I got in my groove of suits, but now, goddamn it, to get me into a suit, it better only be a wedding and unfortunately a funeral. Otherwise, I'm not wearing a suit. Those days are behind me now. Listen, as we're closing off, this is a great conversation. So now I actually know what game theory is. So the next time someone's like, "Oh, that's classic game theory," I could be like,
"Is it?
I know it. Yeah, I know a little bit about this." I'm going to give you 3 very difficult questions, and they're going to get harder and harder and harder as we go along. People come from all over the place for this podcast. Some people come to us because they're from the punk world and they're entering their careers and they just want to hear about it. Some people are from the corporate world and they're leaders, or they're aspiring to be leaders and they want to hear about it. We've got people who are into politics and who come to it. People who are athletes. People who are come from the political arena. People who are come from social activism. A lot of different people listen to this podcast, but they listen for one reason, and they listen because they want to hear about people's takes on leadership. So if you think about leadership, how does that play out for you in your life?
I think the biggest thing is, you know, there has to be something that fulfills you about being a leader. You know, the best leaders really want to see the people that they're leading thrive. And that's an important distinction. You know, I think sometimes people that aren't necessarily natural leaders end up in leadership roles because they're good at kind of focusing on the macro goal. They say, you know, again, the corporate world, you know, we want to drive sales. We've identified this individual is pretty good at doing that. Ultimately, there's going to be a ceiling that you're going to hit if you don't fully invest in the success of the people that you're working with. You know, you have to truly believe that as a leader, you're making people better. And you have to truly believe that, you know, your leadership style or the qualities that you bring to the table are going to be something that somebody can actually latch on to improve how they do business, how they do life, how they run their day-to-day, how their interactions with people are going to go. You have to truly value what being a leader actually entails. And I think that's wanting or maybe believing that you can actually help somebody be the best version of themselves.
All right. Question number 2. It's a 2-part question. Part 1 is, what is one piece of feedback that you've gotten as a leader where you need to grow that you've been successful in addressing? That's part 1. And then part 2 is, what's a piece of feedback that you've gotten about yourself as a leader that you're still working on and you're not there yet on?
There's this old saying, and it's that I love, and it's, do you want to be right? And I think, you know, the idea that being right is maybe not the most important, most important piece of being a leader is something that I've always struggled with. Do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Should have finished the sentence.
Yeah, I was like, that doesn't sound like a saying. It sounded like a question. Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I think, ego-driven sort of early leadership, I might have been one of those guys that said some BS like, culture is going to eat strategy. I might have maybe been that guy, but, there's this idea that we always have to be right. If you're the boss of somebody and they come to you with a problem or, something that needs resolution, you say, well, I'm the leader here. So what I have to communicate here is this idea that there is sort of an objective correct, or there's something that's objectively true. And that's just not always the case. And I think, the ego of it all saying like, I got to be right all the time. You can be offensive, or you can put people off. You can tarnish a relationship that you have with somebody just in this pursuit of saying like, I know this to be true and you have to sort of believe me. Things are a lot more collaborative than just the kind of black and white idea of being right. And I think one thing that I'm, certainly still working on is just this idea that everybody's going to be motivated differently, trying to kind of fine tune how to most quickly get there, how to most quickly understand, what's going to be your motivation versus somebody else that I might be working with's motivation. I think we can all inevitably get there. The quicker you can get there, the less likely it is that you're going to kind of lose that person in the journey. Understanding that you got to lay on the floor with somebody is different than understanding that somebody needs to be told that they're, lazy and they need to get back to work. The more quickly you can kind of understand those dynamics, the better off you're going to be. And I think, that just is going to come from practice and repetition and more importantly, maybe just listening a little bit more than we talk.
All right. So what's feedback that you've gotten that you're still working on? You haven't actually addressed it yet. You haven't been fully successful in addressing it.
I think for me, just shedding the idea that there's something I can contribute to every, conversation. I think we don't all know anything. And I think I'd like to get the opinion in. I like to say, well, here's my thoughts on something. I think as leaders, we don't always need to do that. If you trust in the people around you and you should be able to acquiesce very easily. That's something I think I'm probably still working on.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. Final question. It's a tough one, man. I hope you're ready for it.
Ready.
Okay. Dystopian future. I don't know. Something's happened. We're in a bad spot. You got 5 records and that's it. What are those 5 records?
Oh, man.
That's
the toughest. That is the toughest question. It's supposed to be the easiest question. Shape of Punk to Come.
Okay. So for anyone who doesn't know, Refused, Shape of Punk to Come.
Yeah, that's got to be on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. I think maybe Perfect Pitch Black by Cadence.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I have a kind of a cool sort of personal relationship with that record. It was, oh man, this is so. You really did lay out the toughest question last.
I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry.
Desert Island Records. I mean, how do you do it? How do you do it? So Canadian band Choke for the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
I think like that band was like one of the bands that made me want to play music. I'm going to go weirdly off the grid here, and I'm going to say Discovering the Waterfront by Silverstein. Not something that I think is the majority of what I listen to, but I'll give you a good reason why that one might make it on there. Those guys were from kind of where we were from, and they were the first band that I ever saw that started like touring internationally. Amazing to think that somebody that was from down the street from us was doing that. So for me, I was like, what are these guys doing? They gave us all hope that we could make something of ourselves. So I think that's certainly a pretty cool one. Oh man, what's my 5th record?
Well, you didn't say which Choke record. All I know about Choke is they're Canadian and they have the nicest touring van I've ever seen.
What were they touring in?
And one of their members made fun of me when I was skateboarding out front of the venue and I fell over and I got so mad I wanted to hit him with my skateboard because I was like, how dare you make fun of a skateboarder in front of a punk venue? I was very upset. Very, very. I've never liked that band because of that. Let it be. I'm going on that fact. The bass player made fun of me for skateboarding in front of a venue and bailing, and I just thought, you don't do that. You just don't do that. And that was it. I've never liked them.
Let's go. Needless to Say, which isn't the first record, but I think as far as again, sort of same vibe, like people putting out really cool stuff. They were kind of from Canada, and you went, man, this is I'll have you know, my list would be so different if you gave me time to prepare for this.
I know, that's the point of this, man. And like, this is classic game theory.
Yeah, the classic game theory. There you go. Shout out to Silverstein, by the way, because
a band that I have a lot of respect for is Silverstein. So first of all, they never made fun of me for falling off my skateboard, nor do I think they would. And I think they've done some cool things for Canadian music. Good for them. I think those guys are definitely like legit, like core punk people. You know what, man, I like about this is the last question, and this is the most painful journey I've ever gone with someone to get there. That means these records actually matter to you, which I like. So for anyone who's like, God, this is taking a long time, just back off on my man here. He's really taking it seriously.
Nothing feels good. That was my last record.
That's I'm a bigger fan of 30 Degrees Everywhere, but I'm.
Are you? Can I ask you why?
Well, probably because I'm that idiot that likes the demo of everything better than it's like, I like the demo better. I might be that guy. I might be that idiot. Anyways, listen, man, this was a killer conversation. You crushed it. I learned so much. So as we are closing off, any last words you want to say, any message to the audience, and any plugs you want to give?
I think the biggest thing as far as a message is just, as maybe corny as this is to throw it in the end, don't let your path or your journey be a detriment to you. Really embrace that journey and what you've learned from it. Because like I said, I work at, an international consulting firm. I get to rub elbows with some of the most, sort of creative and cool leaders on the planet, the executives at Fortune 20 companies. I dropped out of business school. I spent my developing years in a band, and all of those things are probably the reason that I'm here. I don't know that if I would have finished school, I would have been. So like I said, maybe it sounds super, super basic, but don't get in your own way. Don't feel like, your path or your drawbacks are something that is ultimately, going to prevent you from doing what you want to do in this life. That's my last thing. And I guess, as far as a plug, the company's called Open Options. You can look into us. It's especially Dr. Fraser, our founder. He's the coolest guy. He's getting up there in his years these days. He's pretty much semi-retired. But I genuinely think this organization has changed the world for the better many, many times over. He has a real ethos about not being evil. If we're working in pharma, we're trying to, give patients better access to drugs. If we're working in, oil and gas, it's about trying to, work on environmental remediation, make the world a little bit greener. So even though we work in some dirty industries, we're trying to do the good work in those industries. So, shout out to Open Options. It's a beautiful place. It's done a lot of really amazing work, and I just couldn't be happier to sort of be where I'm at this point. So, but yeah, and thanks so much, man. This has been such a cool conversation. I like how it's not just a bunch of questions that just get hammered at me. There's more to kind of navigating our way through life than just sort of being able to kind of prepare for everything. But the hardest question was still your last question. I'll die on that hill for sure.
Right on. Okay, Hutton, thank you so much. It's a great conversation, and everyone, I'll see you in the outro. Spencer, drop the beat. What?